Bibles to Genesis chapter 4, if you will. We are going to look tonight at life after the fall. Chapter 4 begins with the birth of Cain and followed relatively soon after by the birth of his brother Abel. You know that God is condensing the timeline when the births of Cain and Abel are mentioned in the same verse. we know that we're not dealing with chronological time here, but we're dealing with a recap. Eve makes an interesting statement, though, and I want you to, in the very first verse of Genesis chapter 4, it says, Adam made love to his wife Eve, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. She said, with the help of the Lord, I have brought forth a man. It's an interesting statement, and if you'll think of it in light of what the promise was that God made to Eve when he was pronouncing the judgment for their sin, what did she say? What did he say specifically to Eve that would take place in Eve's children? The seed of the woman would crush the serpent's head, although the serpent would bruise his heel. The seed of the woman. Isn't it interesting that she says, the Lord has helped me give birth to a man-child who would perhaps in her mind be the seed that was going to be the deliverer. Now we know that God had another plan, but in her mind, she was thinking about the day that was going to come where her descendant was going to wreak a final work of defeat on the serpent that had brought such damage. Can you imagine the anticipation of Cain's birth? Can you imagine how,
it never happened.
Firstborn children are always a great time of anticipation. But can you imagine how they must have anticipated the birth of Cain? You know, Sherry's got a countdown app on her phone for when her retirement takes place. You know, if they had iPhones back in Adam's day, or in Adam's day, there certainly would have been an app for the birth of Cain. Because I'm sure they counted every nuance of every moment. It was with such great anticipation that it's the first child to be born. I was pondering that this afternoon, and I'm thinking, well, you know, they may have seen the birth process take place in animals. They may have observed that, but this is the first child to be born, and so it certainly had to be something of significant interest to them, and every detail. Matter of fact, as parents, I think we're guilty somewhat. We pay attention to everything that happens with our first child. And with the second one, it's like, oh yeah, we've done that before. You know, and there's a little bit of a dismissal of some of those things, even as they grow older. But there was certainly great anticipation at Cain's birth. As I read through Genesis 4, there are a number of possibilities for discussion, things that we could have given our attention to as we've been discussing the birth of the first children, the nature of worship, how Cain and Abel enter into worship. We're going to talk a little bit about that tonight. Unresolved emotions and the effects of unresolved emotions. You'll see in Cain, and them demonstrated in his grandson, probably 4 or 5 generations removed. We will see the same anger that was unresolved in Cain transmitted down to a grandson who became a very angry, violent kind of person. We could have addressed the idea of human responsibility. Cain says to God, am I my brother's keeper? Is he my problem? Well, the sad news is, yes, he is. Okay. And not only because Cain was responsible for his condition, but in a very real sense, there is a certain measure that we carry responsibility. Patsy asked us to pray a few minutes ago for other believers as we move through the difficulties of our time. And there is a certain measure of accountability and maybe a better word would be responsibility that we have for our fellow human beings. When you see somebody trying to push a car out of the middle of the road, there's something that compels us to get out of the car. As a matter of fact, I had a situation happen last summer. I was coming down Standiford Avenue and to the Coffee intersection, and there was an older gentleman that I had watched walk across the street, come from the west side of Coffee across to the Walgreens drugstore, do some business there, and then by the time I got to the intersection and was wanting to turn right, this gentleman was ready to walk back across the street. And it was obvious he was not going to get across the street before the light changed. And people just kept turning left in front of him and just kept cutting across. And I couldn't stand it any longer. I got out and walked out into the middle of the street and I said, "You, stop!" And everything ended. And this guy walked across the street and got to the other side. And some guy started to cut in behind him. I said, "You wait a minute!" But I couldn't stand to see them mistreat that guy. And I thought, how can we just sit by and let somebody do that to this obviously impaired gentleman who simply couldn't walk fast enough to get across the street? When I got back to my truck, I was kind of weak in the knees. It was one of those kinds of things. But there is a responsibility that we have, and we could have spent a long time talking about that, but we're not going to, because we're going to talk about family dynamics. Family dynamics after the fall. Let's do as we've done, because I'd like for us to read through this together. Can we begin at verse 1 of chapter 4, and can we read on down through verse 16? And that'll give us a pretty good overview of what we're going to talk about tonight. Who'd like to begin at verse 1 and read down through, say, verse 4? Gary, okay? And then Molly, if you'll take 5 through 8. Okay? All right, Gary, go ahead.
And Adam knew Eve as his wife, and she became pregnant and bore Cain. And she said, "I have gotten and gained a man with the help of the Lord." And next she gave birth to his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. And in the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground. And Abel brought of the firstborn of his flock, and of the fat portions. And the Lord had respect and regard for Abel and for his offering.
Okay, Molly.
But he did not respect Cain and his offering, and Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. So the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin lies at the door, and its desires is for you, but not should rule over it." Now Cain talked with Abel, his brother, and it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel, his brother, and killed him.
Okay, somebody pick up at verse 9. Who'd do that for us? Okay, Betty?
Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is Abel, your brother?" He said, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" And he said, "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." So now you are cursed from the earth, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you till the ground, it shall no longer yield its strength to you. A fugitive and a vagabond you shall be on the earth.
Okay? And verse 13 through 16, who'll do that for us? Thank you, Vern.
So Cain said unto the Lord, My punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, thou hast driven me out of this day from the face of the earth, and from thy face shall I be hid. And I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond in the earth, and it shall come to pass that every man that findeth me shall slay me. The Lord said unto him, Therefore whosoever slayeth Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. The Lord set a mark upon Cain, as any finding him should kill him. And Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod, on the east of Eden.
Is there a sadder verse? No. And Cain went out from the presence of the Lord. Those are powerful words, and those are very dark words. And he dwelled in the land of Nod, which in Hebrew means wandering.
That means what?
Wandering.
Wandering.
And it goes right back to God saying, you will be a wanderer. And now here's a guy who had made his living growing crops. And now, because of how he treated his brother, he ceases to be able to grow anything. God said the ground is going to be cursed and you will not be able to harvest the crops. Your destiny will be to be a wanderer wherever you go. It occurred to me as I was reading this passage that Cain was the firstborn. And I don't know why I had never thought of that before in terms of his conflict with Abel. And it's part of what made me think about this being family dynamics after the fall. Because we all know that it doesn't make any difference how well managed a family is. You're going to have sibling rivalry and conflict. Matter of fact, one of the funny things that happened to my dad before he passed away, when he realized that he had lived longer than any of his brothers and sisters, he told my brother, well, I can die now and that'll be okay. And my brother said, why? And Dad said, because I've outlived all my brothers and sisters. I thought there's sibling rivalry to a whole new level.
Right.
You know? I don't, that's not on my radar screen at all. I hadn't considered Cain's actions in light of his role as the oldest son. And I think that that's significant for us in light of what human relationships are, and especially human relationships after the fall. Now, we don't know what human relationships were like before the fall, other than just the little glimpse that we've been given of Adam and Eve. But it looks like things were pretty peaceful, like things were pretty amicable between Adam and Eve. And so I'm not trying to paint something here that isn't really here. But with the birth and growth to maturity of Cain and Abel, we see evidence of the fall's influence. What are some of the things, as we've read the text, do you see anything in there that would indicate the fall's influence on a relationship with Cain and Abel? I didn't go into it as deeply as one of the commentaries that I was reading today did, but there is a way to rephrase fully within the context of the Hebrew language. So it would not be a wrestling of an interpretation, that it could easily have been within Eve's mindset that this was a deliverer. I have given birth to the deliverer.
Well, and to make up for my mistake.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're right on target. Anybody else see any other interpersonal dynamics going on here? And remember, we're talking about two men. What's another element that usually enters the interaction between men? Competition. And the little brother beat the big brother.
That's right.
Okay?
And he will try.
Now, I don't think we are doing violence to the text here at all in terms of what we're seeing that stimulates this conflict between the two. Now, the ultimate point of difference is the fact that the sacrifices were responded to differently by God. But what I wanted us to see is the influence immediately of the fall in these guys' lives. And I wanted to go immediately to the competition idea because it points directly back to something that we do have scriptural documentation for. You have the reference there in your notes, Isaiah 14, and we want to read verses 12 through 15, and I'll just go ahead and read it in the interest of time here. How have you fallen from heaven, morning star, son of the dawn? You have been cast down to the earth, you who once laid low the nations. You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit enthroned on the mountain of the assembly, on the utmost heights of Mount Zion. I will ascend above the tops of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. Who's talking there? Satan. Satan. I will make myself like the Most High. I will usurp God's place, God's position, God's authority, and I will take over Israel. That's the whole conflict in a nutshell, right there. Okay? And now what do we see here with Cain and Abel on the heels, at least from a chapter standpoint, on the heels of the fall? I mean, we know there's got to be somewhere in the vicinity of 20 to 25 years that's transpired here for them to both become adult men. But we get this intrusion immediately of the spirit of the fall that gets injected into the relationship of Cain and Abel. It's amazing. The real story of this chapter centers around the offering of a sacrifice. There was no priestly order in those days. As a matter of fact, the father was considered the priest of the home and would do all of those priestly functions. But I want you to go back with me again, and I want you to look with me at verses 2 through 7 and find if there might be things there that indicate how they knew to offer sacrifices. Does that strike you as an interesting thing? That we have no sacrificial example except in the animals that were killed to make the clothing for Adam and Eve. So now we have Cain and Abel coming and they're offering sacrifices. And one's accepted and one isn't accepted. So what indications do we have? And you can focus on verses 2 through 7. That's where it talks about it primarily. What are things there that you might see that would be indicators that they had been given some kind of instruction on offering sacrifices? Think he was commended for bringing the fat of the sacrifice. Now, if you go into the Levitical offerings, you will find there are two things that could not be given to anyone else: the blood and the fat. And specifically, it was the fat of they call it the subcutaneous fat underneath the skin, and the fat around the entrails. Now, being an old meat cutter, a cow has two kidneys like we all do, but around the kidney is a huge, what they call cod of fat. The kidney is only about maybe a little bit bigger than your fist, but the fat is about this long, and it probably, wouldn't you say, Vern, about this big around the kidney? I mean, it is encased in fat. And that fat is very, very dense. If it's a high grade of cattle, to break the external casing of that fat is not an easy thing to do. Matter of fact, if sometimes it's necessary to slam the fat down on the cutting table that you're using to break the fat open a little bit, because even the very sharp knives that a meat cutter would use are not always able to cut through the fat easily. It can be a real challenging thing. So there's a lot of fat on the inside of an animal. And the blood and the fat were two things that no one else could take except God. And specifically, it says that the fat is something that was burned on the altar and it became a sweet-smelling savor. Now, allow me a very untheological illustration. Is there anything that smells better on a barbecue grill than a little piece of fat that falls down on the briquettes and then begins to smolder, and the fragrance of that begins to rise? It is one of the most, when you walk outside and you can smell somebody barbecuing, that's what you're smelling. You're not smelling the meat. You're smelling the fat that's on the outside edge of whatever it is that's being barbecued. And it's especially true if you're barbecuing pork ribs. The fragrance of that is amazing. Isn't it interesting that Abel brought the fat? That's a significant point. The fat portions from the firstborn of the flock. That's an indicator. I mean, who of us would think that fat would be something that would be brought as a gift to anybody? You wouldn't think that. But Abel brought the fat of the first of the flock. Okay? Now, with all deference to Cain, he brought the best that he had. But it doesn't appear that it was what was prescribed. And that is the conclusion that I want you to come to. But there's a couple of other points I want you to see with me that I believe gives us a scriptural basis for saying that God did instruct them. They did know what the sacrifices were about, even to the point that there was a sacrificial period for them, that a certain period of time would pass, and that was the appropriate time for them to offer sacrifices, similar to what Israel did with the feasts of the year. The feasts were almost always associated with a harvest of some sort, and at the end of that harvest, then they celebrated and they offered specialized sacrifices. 7.
In 7, God says, if you do what is right,
Very good.
you'll be accepted. So that means that God's already told them there's a right way to do this.
If he didn't know what was right,
He's not held accountable.
God could not have judged him for that. Well, and it becomes another reflection of the fall. Who gets to call the shots? Who's the one who determines what's appropriate and what isn't? Okay? So we have, number one, Abel brought some very specific, very unusual items to offer to God. Things that we would not normally consider to be delicacies, if you will. Okay? Secondly, God said to Cain, if you do the right thing, you're not going to be corrected for having done the wrong thing. The third one is a little harder to see, and it really does come from a different reading of the Hebrew text, and it's found in verse 3. The phrase, in the course of time. Does anybody's Bible read that any differently?
Process of time.
In the process of time. The literal Hebrew is at the end of days. And it's as if a specified period of time came to a conclusion. And now it was time for them to bring the sacrifice. And it goes right back. I like your rendering because at the end of the harvest, then what did they do? They came to bring a sacrifice for what God had given them. Okay? And so what God has ordained for them is a proper period of time in which to bring the sacrifice. What God has ordained for them is the proper elements to bring of the sacrifice. And then the third thing is that there were touchstones, things that they needed to do this offering correctly. So when we look at Cain's offering, God is not being flippant. And now we know that he wouldn't be that anyway. But nor is he being cavalier, nor is he being prejudicial. Cain didn't bring the right offering. Okay? Cain failed in what God had clearly instructed them to do. And I agree with you, Linda. I don't think we have any other example to appeal to than the animals that God apparently killed in order to create the clothing for Adam and Eve to cover their nakedness. Okay? And because of that being a critical moment, because they're coming out of the fall, because God is setting things, kind of a reset, so to speak, so that they will have coverings and their nakedness will not be apparent to everyone, it would be an appropriate thing for us to consider there, that here is where God said, all right, and now for your succeeding generations, here's what I want you to do. And this is the way for you to express your appreciation to me. Okay? Okay. In a general sense, the sacrifice, those were very specific items. In a broader, more general sense, the sacrifice itself was significant to them because what they were bringing, the Hebrew word that's used here for their offering, means to bring tribute. And so what they're doing is they're bringing to God in the same way that a servant would bring, a servant king would bring to the king that he is serving under, would bring tribute to that king in the form of money or clothing or other gifts that would be a reflection of saying thank you to the king for providing protection and food and etc., etc., so that this king and the second king and his people would be safe. It's that same kind of tribute that these offerings, it's giving tribute to one who is worthy to be thanked. And that's what's going on here. And God was very clear. There is a very meaningful and a very serious reason for why Cain's sacrifice was not received. And it's significant. It's not just a history lesson about what happened back there. It's about what's important for us. And it really does speak to the issue of worship. It speaks to the issue of worship and how you and I approach the throne of God. There are ways for us to approach Him. And we see Cain approaching God in a way that was missing a vital component. And that's what we're going to pick up and talk about next week. Okay?